Hey everybody, so this can be a quick little tutorial on the splined spindle to crank arm interface, which was found basically after they started doing the square tapers, or I guess it was, you could call the next evolution from the square taper spindle crank arm to bottom bracket spindle whatever. Anyway, this is just kind of a little page from the Wikipedia bottom bracket page, and starts a square taper. Then you go from spline. I think Shimano was the first to actually do a mass-produced setup called the Octilink. This is Shimano's current page, and this is basically what they offer. Looks like they do some decent stuff still in track cranks, and then as far as otherwise, it's just basic low-end mountain bike cranks. So yeah, you can still get a few parts here and there as far as Shimano wise, and it was a decent system at the time. And then you have the I.S.I.S drive, which is the International Splined Interface, whatever, I don't know. So the basic differences, this is kind of Truvative's, Raceface, all the other companies' answer to Shimano's patented 8-splined setup, which the I.S.I.S drive setup is a 10-spline. I'll put some links and documents and things with more info if you would like to dig a little deeper into the information. But these systems were pretty common from maybe the late 90s, 99, 2000 or so, up into about 2004. They were pretty much the top-notch technology of the time. I think the first time I ever really saw these was actually in the BMX industry. The Redline Flight cranks was probably the first spline cranks that I saw. But anyway, back to this topic. There's going to be two types. You're going to need a crank puller like this Park one here. I'll put a link in the description down in the video if you want to purchase one of these, if you've got either a I.S.I.S or Octilink style crank and you need to remove it. So some of them you're going to require a crank puller. If you undo the bolt there and it just comes right out, crank's still on, you're going to need a crank puller. I'll get to the other type here in just a bit, a little further on in the video, and it's a one key release type, so the crank puller is basically built into the bolt and crank arm assembly. So basically you want to tighten that crank arm puller there all the way in. So that's kind of that's the I.S.I.S system there. That's what it looks like, the spindle once you pull the crank arm off. Basically backing off the crank puller here. It's very important that you tighten that all the way down in there. I've seen quite a few of these cranks, square taper and the spline, where the threads just got pulled out because the crank arm puller wasn't fully engaged, fully tight. So you want to make sure you get that fully tight. It's just aluminum threads that's going into, so if it's not all the way in there, it's going to come right out. That's basically your splined bottom bracket tool. This works with most all I.S.I.S and Shimano bottom brackets. There's a few high-end Shimano. The old Durace you have to use a crank spanner wrench as well, but most of them use that. Pretty much all your square taper cartridge bottom brackets will use that tool as well. I'll put a link to that. You want to make sure you align the splines correctly. I had it misaligned there earlier, which is, believe it or not, a fairly common issue sometimes with kind of beginner do-it-yourselfers trying to work on these. So just always make sure that those are in a 180-degree parallel plane. The cranks are going straight across. Just all you gotta do is eyeball it. It's pretty simple. Using my 8mm Park tool here. Put a link to this one as well in the description if you would like to purchase a wrench like this. Any old 8mm work. That one's kind of nice because it's got a nice handle. But anyway, that's one key release type. This is I think it's a 105 or Ultegra crank. That one. This one's on my clunker bike. Same system. I wanted to show it a little more in depth. You can usually tell the one key release because it's got those two little two little holes there, which you would use a spanner wrench to disassemble it. But the gist of this is you undo the bolt, it's going to be loose for just a minute, then it's going to contact the edge of that little ring there that's threaded in on top of the bolt. So it acts basically as the bolt itself acts as a crank puller. So you just keep loosening, and it'll be tight, loosen up for maybe half a turn or two, or one or two, and then it gets tight again. And that's basically the edge of the flange of the bolt itself going up against the little ring there with the two holes that's threaded into the crank arm. And so it's acting as a crank puller. It's all kind of built in there. It's like the dust cap is the crank puller. So basically you just keep loosening, and then eventually the crank's gonna just disengage. You can see it's loose there, the other arm's falling away, and there you go. So on these Shimano Octilinks, there is a version 1 and 2. The mountain bike splines are 9 millimeters deep. The road ones are 5 millimeters deep. So it's pretty important you make sure you get the right one if you're looking for another bottom bracket or whatever. And there are a few different widths in these as well. So that's something it's usually marked on the bottom bracket shell, as these are all cartridge, primarily all cartridge units, except for the Dura-Ace version, which uses a roller and small ball bearings. You actually have to manually adjust those, but everything else you just bolt it in and pretty much get the right width and go. So here I'm putting it back in. You may notice I cleaned everything up there a little bit. I had a viewer kind of saying all my stuff was really dirty when I worked on it, which, good point, Anyway, cleaned it up there. Hopefully that's visually satisfying. Anyway, torquing her down here, and yeah, it's I'm not sure what the actual torque spec is, but normally you can feel it kind of bottom out, just snug it up to that point, really. So anyway, back to the splined. This is just a park tool. I'll put a link to that if you want to buy one of these, possibly. If you're going to be working on square taper or these bottom brackets, it's a handy tool to have. And as well-meaning do-it-yourself bike mechanics and even mechanics in shops, sometimes they'll over-torque these things, thinking that there's a creak in the bottom bracket, or these are getting up there in age, 15, 20 years old, so sometimes they're kind of seized in. I'm using a ratchet here, and then I used a crescent wrench there to kind of form a T. Sometimes that works, sometimes not. Here it was, I'm having difficulty keeping it in there, and so sometimes you want to use something with a little more leverage. You can use a breaker bar or something like that, or you can just I just used a rear quick release skewer on here, and then a big crescent wrench, and then I actually put a big breaker bar on top of this. It was probably 3 foot long, and broke this thing loose. That's kind of what the I guess the version 2 style that has the long square taper. This was just a random video clip that I was putting one of these on a repair there. So yeah, it's the version 2 is the deep spline. The version 1's more on your road bikes and such like that. But yeah, anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully, if you're dealing with one of these, this gave you some good, helpful info. Got plenty more videos that are bike tutorial related. So anyway, you might want to check those out, or possibly subscribe to my channel. And yeah, thanks for watching.